Hey there, my name is Adam Keller, and I'm a senior technologist here at AWS. In this video, we're going to talk about CDK assets and walk through a live demo of how you can leverage assets within your CDK applications. So what are CDK assets? Assets are local files, directories, or container images that can be bundled into CDK libraries and applications, and can represent any artifact that the app needs to operate. This means that users can couple their application-related assets alongside their infrastructure code, all within the CDK app, providing a central location to define your build workflows coupled with your infrastructure as code. Let's explain through some examples. As mentioned before, there are three ways that users can include their assets within their CDK applications. We'll start by looking at single-file assets. An asset can represent a single file, which could be a configuration file that an application depends on. It can also be application-specific code, whether that's a ready-to-go zip file containing the application and dependencies required to run using AWS Lambda, a jar file, or a simple block of code that doesn't have any dependencies and can easily be ran as a Lambda function. Assets can also represent directories with multiple files nested underneath. This could represent the handler code and all of the dependencies required for a Lambda function to run. Assets are exposed through APIs by specific AWS constructs. For example, the Lambda function construct has the code property, which lets you pass an asset, and in turn it will build and compile those assets and use them for the function's code. Additionally, you can pass specific build commands and instructions to ensure that the asset gets built as expected and required. For those that prefer to leverage container images to build and run their applications, an asset could be a container image. This will help with building the container image and pushing it to a container registry in Amazon ECR. When building on AWS Lambda, the code from asset image property will use the container image as the application code base. This can also be used for building and deploying container images to Amazon ECS by using the from Docker image asset property. Let's look at a generic DevOps workflow and see how all of this comes together. We start with testing and building our application, whether that be a container image or an application-specific artifact that we need to compile and/or install dependencies. Next, we need to push our artifact to the proper repository. For example, if we're building a container image, we have to push that to a container registry. Finally, we deploy our image or our artifact, and then also have to deploy that artifact to lower environments and possibly to production if we have full CI/CD. With the CDK, this is all bundled into the asset construct, eliminating the need to have this process live somewhere else, providing a seamless experience when defining your applications alongside cloud resources. So let's move to our IDE and demonstrate this functionality in real time. Okay. So we have our CDK app already initialized, and we're going to start with a single file asset that represents a JSON configuration file. You can see here we have an assets directory, and under single file assets is where we have a config.json. If we want to see what that looks like, it looks like this. So let's go ahead and create that single file asset that represents that JSON object. So we're going to start by defining our asset. So we're going to S3 demo asset. We'll say new. Let's actually import this library asset from, and this will be the S3 assets library. We'll say new asset. And let's name this S3 single file asset. And what we're going to do is pass this construct a path. So let's also import path, the path library, path as import all as path from path. Okay. So what you can see here, here's all the various options available to you. We'll look at bundling in just a moment, but check out the documentation to read more on the different inputs that are available when working with assets. But like I said, we're going to actually talk about bundling in just a moment here. So we're going to set our path. to path.join dir name, and then we will point it to our assets directory under single file assets config.json. Perfect. So that's all we need, and we're going to actually put a comment here. So this will be our single file asset, which will be stored in S3. And these assets are stored when you bootstrap your account and region. The CDK creates an S3 bucket and an ECR repository where ECR container image assets get stored in that ECR repository, and any sort of S3 asset gets stored in that S3 bucket. So there's ways that you can do this where it's not a global bucket and a global ECR repo using the app staging synthesizer. There's a link below if you want to read more on that and how to scope your assets to your CDK app. But in this case, we are using the default stack synthesizer, so we are leveraging that shared asset bucket and eventually ECR repo when we deploy that as well. Okay, so let's create a CloudFormation output. And let's see here, cdk.cfn output. And we'll just name this asset URL. And we'll make this value, let's make it dynamic. And actually, since we're going to, once they upload the file, the CDK CLI uploads the file, and it's done, I'd like to pull that file down and see what it looks like. So that's what we're going to do here. And we're going to leverage the S3 bucket name property and the S3 object key property, which is perfect. And that is it. So at this point, when I run a CDK deploy, what we're going to see, and actually let's do that. So we're going to do a CDK deploy. The CDK is going to check the file. And in addition, it will actually create, it'll generate a SHA that indicates the current position of the file and that file where it stands in this moment of deployment. And anytime that file is changed, the CDK CLI is going to compare the SHA, and if there's a difference and a change, it will upload a new file. So as we can see, I have deployed this asset, and we have our S3 output here. So we're going to just take this, and you can see this is our bucket, and this is that asset bucket, and then this is the artifact with the SHA, and then it's that .json file. So we're going to do AWS S3 CP, copy this file here, and we're going to just locally download it as S3 config.json. Hopefully I did that right. Perfect. So if we cat S3 config.json, we can see there is my asset. So if we were to compare it to the assets directory, single file asset config.json, you can see there's no difference. It's the same file. Perfect. So that is a single file asset and an example of how you can leverage the CDK to take that single file asset and store it in S3 on your behalf. Now, the next step is to look at directory assets. And then what we're going to do is create a Lambda function that's going to point to a directory asset which has the code that we need for my Lambda function to run. And in addition, I'd like to grant access to my Lambda function to access that object in S3 so it can pull that down and actually use that artifact for its whatever purposes it needs. Okay, so now we're going to start with directory assets. And again, directory assets are stored in S3. And in this case, we are going to leverage the AWS Lambda CDK library. So let's import all as Lambda from, and then we have AWS Lambda here. Okay, so we're going to start by creating our asset. Now, earlier I had mentioned that the assets are exposed through various APIs across other constructs. So the Lambda construct has the Lambda library, and the code construct has its own property from asset, where it leverages the underlying assets library to bundle that code and then push it to S3 and then sync that code with the Lambda function. So we're going to start by creating our asset. So we're going to call this Lambda asset, and we're going to lambda.code. And then you see the various options available to me. I have from asset image, from bucket. So if I uploaded this in some other process, I could always pull from the bucket, and so on. I could even inline. I could just have my code written inside of the property itself here, but we're not going to do that. It's a better practice to actually use an asset and leverage that. And we're going to start with the from asset property. Okay. So very similar to what we did above, we're going to set the path, which is going to be the same path earlier, except if you look in our assets directory, we have Lambda API service. So if we take a look at what's in that directory, you can see we have a Docker file, which we're not going to use right now. We have a build script. We have our index.js, and this index.js is an application that uses the lorem ipsum library and simply just returns random text generated from the lorem ipsum library. In addition, we actually want to interact with that single file asset that we uploaded and pull those values in and leverage them. Again, this is just a simple demo to demonstrate how we can connect assets with our cloud resources, but just to give you an idea, this is what the code looks like. So we have let's do Lambda API asset. So going back here. And so we're going to point to this directory. We also have our dependencies defined in our asset directory, in that package JSON, which is going to install those packages for us. Now, I can just leverage what's in this directory and just bundle up everything that's in there. And you can see I have a node modules directory in there, so I've already installed the packages there. But I would prefer to actually have the CDK do this every time we build the asset. And this will ensure that I can have that build process, installing the dependencies and everything, all bundled within my CDK code, so I don't have to worry about building this somewhere else and defining this workflow in a separate process. So if you were to look at this build.sh script, basically I have some commands here, and I'll explain in just a moment. But what you'll notice is I'm just installing packages, and then I want to compile this as a zip file in a certain location. So in order to add that build process, what I need to do is look into the bundling input. The bundling input allows me to have more control over how we bundle this asset. So in this example, what I want to do is actually I want to leverage a container image to build the asset in the way I want it to be built, following, running the commands that I've defined in that build.sh script. And I want that to be the asset that the CDK uploads. So what we can do is define our image here. And in this case, I'm going to pull a Docker image from an upstream registry, which, let me see, I have this copied somewhere. So I want to pull down the Node.js Alpine image. And what's nice about using a container image in the bundling process is you are always going to have that immutable artifact, that container image, in the state that you expect it to be in, and it's going to run the same build process every time. So that's how we know that we're getting consistency, and we don't have to worry about local file system, what packages are installed there and what versions of what software. I have that all defined in my Docker image. Okay, so we'll just change a couple other things here. We'll set the output type, bundling output, to archived, because we're going to archive this file ourselves. And then we're going to pass in a command. And actually, the command I want to run is just build.sh. That's that shell script that I had posted earlier. And then we'll say user root. Perfect. Okay, so we have our Lambda asset defined now. What we've said is here's the directory that we want you to build the asset from. And then we've passed in some parameters from the bundling input to make sure that it's built in the way that we expect it to be built. And again, read the API documentation. There's a lot more you can do with this to customize this to make it fit your particular use case. Okay, so next we want to actually define our Lambda function. So let's go with a new Lambda function here. So we'll name this demo function, and we'll say new Lambda function. Okay, so now what I want to do is I'm going to start by saying passing in the code. Now, the code in this case is again going to be that asset from that directory that the CDK is going to build on my behalf. So we're going to pass in Lambda asset. And then we have to tell the function construct what the handler is and what runtime we want to use. So for the runtime, let's go with the latest Node.js, lambda.runtime Node.js. We'll go with 18. And we're going to set our handler. So our handler here is index.handler. And we know that because if we cat the assets Lambda API index.js, we can see that we have our handler defined here, and our file is index.js. Perfect. Okay. So what we want to do now is we can deploy this, but the next step is remember I mentioned, I want to grant access to my Lambda function or to my object in S3 for my Lambda function. So that single file asset that I uploaded up here, I want to make sure that my Lambda function has access to it so it can pull that configuration down to make sure that my application operates, with this configuration file. So what we'll do, and this is one of my personal favorite components of the CDK, is the higher level constructs, these L2 constructs, is we can leverage the grant methods. So let's go with our S3 demo asset, and we're going to grant read access to our demo function. So notice I didn't have to author additional IAM policies. I didn't have to do a whole bunch of work to connect all of these together. It's one line, one method, grant read to this object. So let's also add some environment variables, because if you notice, my application does look for a bucket and it looks for that key. And again, this is just a demo application, but we get those from the environment. So I'm going to, with the demo function object, we're going to add environment. And this is how you add environment variables. And we'll S3 demo assets.s3 bucket name. So we have our config bucket, and let's do one more. And let's do config key, and this will be S3 object key. Okay, so now we are ready to deploy our Lambda function, as well as build our asset, which is located in the Lambda API service directory, which has a custom build script, and which will run an npm install, and it will bundle the code as I need it to be bundled, and then the rest the CDK will handle. So let's run a CDK deploy. And we're going to wait for the deploy to complete, and then we will come back and talk through what happened. Okay, so our Lambda function has been deployed, and we granted access for that Lambda function to access the bucket and the key for that single file object, that single file asset object. We created a bundling process to build our to build our asset. And then we passed that asset into our demo function, and the CDK built the asset, deployed it to S3, configured the Lambda function to point to that asset, and now we have our code up and running. So The last thing I want to do before we move into the console and we actually look at our function running is I want to deploy a Lambda function, but I want to leverage a container image asset this time. So to do that, what we're going to do is we'll deploy a brand new Lambda function. So we'll keep our code here and we're going to add a second Lambda function. But I'm also going to change how we build our asset. So we're going to name this Lambda container image asset. We're going to say lambda.code. Now remember, we used the from asset earlier. This time we're going to use from asset image. And here we have all of our build steps and everything bundled into our container image or our Docker file. And that Docker file has all of our build steps defined. If we were to look at that, assets, Lambda API service, Docker file. So in this case, we run npm install. We copy our code into the Lambda task root directory, and then we just run index.handler on startup, on launch. So that's my Docker file, and I want the CDK to build the Docker image. I want it to deploy that image to Amazon ECR, and I want it to connect the Lambda function to that image running in ECR. So let's do that now. Okay, so very similar to what we did above when we were defining our directory asset. So we're going to path.join, and then we're going to go to our assets directory, Lambda API service, and we're going to point to the same directory. So notice I'm defining my assets in the same directory. The difference here being we're using the from asset image property. So what the CDK is going to do is it's going to look in this directory for a Docker file. Now, if I have a different name for that file, I can always pass in a different name of the file if needed. But in this case, see asset name, I could, it could be Docker file 2, whatever that is. So you have a lot of flexibility here with how you build. So similar to above, we're going to create a new Lambda function. So we're going to say container image function. And then we'll say new lambda.function. And we'll say this. And then we'll say container image function. And we're going to do, again, very similar to what we did above, with a slight difference here. So instead of passing in, similar to what we did there, actually, we'll pass in our container image asset. But when we define our runtime, because we're running from a container image, what we're going to do is we don't need to pass runtime or the handler into the Lambda function property because that's all defined in the container image. So what I'm going to do here is just say Lambda runtime.container .from image. And then for my handler code, same thing. I'm going to say lambda.handler.from image. So by leveraging these enums, I am instructing the Lambda function construct in this case to rely on the Docker image asset for the runtime and the handler, because that is all defined in my Docker image, and the Lambda function itself doesn't need to know about that. So we're going to do that. And you know what? Up above too, let's add a timeout. I didn't add that, so we could just say, yeah, we'll say 30 seconds is good. And we'll add a timeout to this function as well. So timeout 30 seconds. And similar to what we did up here, I want to grant access to this function. So we're going to do that here, container image function. And then here we'll do container image function. And we'll add these environment variables. Okay, so now this is all done and ready to go and ready to deploy via the CDK. So we're going to let the CDK deploy. And again, this time what it's going to do is build a Docker image. It's going to push that image to Amazon ECR and then connect our Lambda function to that image. So this will take a few minutes. We're going to let this run, and then we'll come back when it's done. Okay, so our container image has been deployed. It was deployed to the Lambda function, and now we're ready to go to the AWS console. So what we have here in the console is our two Lambda functions that we deployed. One is of package type zip, which is when we use the directory asset to bundle and build our application code. And then we have the package type of image, which is when we leveraged the container image asset functionality, which looked at our Docker file, built it, pushed it to Amazon ECR, and then connected it to the Lambda function. So if we go to the image function, if we want to test it, let's click test, and then let's look at the output. And what we can see is the body returned lorem ipsum. And also you'll notice the S3 config, if you remember those values I mentioned earlier in that config.json, you can see that our application was able to properly talk to the S3 bucket, the permissions were granted, and it was able to pull that configuration file in. So of course, if we wanted to look at the zip package type, we could absolutely look at that too. And you can see everything the way it was built. You got my node modules here. You have my index.js. Of course, we can test this as well. And what we should see is a very similar response to what we had in our image function. So there you go. Same thing. We have our S3 config. We were able to see that output and so on. So that wraps up our intro to CDK assets. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. And of course, there will be more content that comes in the coming days and weeks. So hit that subscribe button, keep an eye out, and thanks so much for your time.